Thank you so much, Wes. And of course, thanks to ASIL for all of the support and really also just for highlighting climate change and international climate change law. It's so important. So it's a wonderful opportunity to have this vehicle to kind of begin to think through all of the complex questions that we know about and that we need to be thinking about in the context of international law and climate change. And thanks to everyone in the audience for being here today as well. What I want to do now is just offer a few framing thoughts for our discussion. And then I'll introduce our speakers. But before I even do that, I just want to encourage everybody who's in attendance to be sure and use the question and answer function. So you can put any questions you might have into the question and answer box, and I'll try to keep track of those, and we'll try to leave some time at the end for those questions. Now, as of yesterday, the United States had recorded, and this is just thinking about the US and not even globally, the US had recorded 485,000 deaths and 27.6 million COVID cases. And so we're gathered here together today, really not just on the precipice of, but actually in the cauldron of a disaster. And as scholars who think at the intersection of climate change, environmental law, and disaster law, we know that disasters destabilize social and economic systems, expose and exacerbate inequality, and reveal both the promise and pitfalls of existing systems of law and policy. And of course, overlapping and intersecting disasters compound these effects and reveal our social and legal capacities and limitations. Each disaster teaches us about ourselves, our local and global preparedness, our ability to process and respond to information and uncertainty, our ability to act collectively to minimize risks, our ability to see and respond to existing structures of inequality, and our ability to really leverage the rule of law as a tool for stability and equity. The COVID-19 pandemic is at once a global and a local crisis. It's sped at shocking speed across the world, prompting near unprecedented levels of global and local disruption. It's made us all pay attention all at the same time. It has taught us all how precariously we are perched at the intersections of globalization, environmental degradation, and disaster. It's also taught us the depths of crisis that can really descend upon us seemingly unaware, and how violently abrupt change can rip at the seams of social stability and structural inequality. And it's taught us what we should have already known, and in what is and will be the story of climate change. Our interconnectedness to one another and to the ecosystems upon which we depend is both one of our greatest strengths and one of our greatest weaknesses. Now, the costs of the pandemic are incalculably high, but the cost of the creeping crises, sudden onset disasters, and abrupt change associated with climate change will be even higher. COVID thus has really much to teach us about disaster generally and about climate change specifically. Leaving room for the many lessons to come, we know that the pandemic is exposing and exacerbating structural inequalities and gaps and weaknesses in the rule of law within and between states. Within this already fraught context, climate change does and will act as a threat multiplier, exacerbating existing and now kind of COVID aggravated weaknesses, inequities, and vulnerabilities. And as disasters continue to swell in number and intensity, so too will the compound effects. So thus, as we really attempt to recover and rebuild from the pandemic, we must take lessons from climate change for climate change. Because like the pandemic, climate change really brings the promise and perils of our interconnectedness to the fore. Our common but really unevenly experienced drive for economic development powered by fossil fuels and the resulting intermixing of greenhouse gases in our shared atmosphere binds us all together. The collective action nature of climate change is widely understood. The extent and unevenness of the distribution of harms is similarly well known. Yet still relatively little has been done to kind of constrain the emissions that bring about harm. So short of throwing out the entire playbook, where can we start in the process of thinking about climate change? What has COVID taught us? What role does the rule of law have to play? These are some of the questions that we're here to discuss today. And to help advance the conversation, we're joined by Dan Farber, Leslie Ann Duvic-Paoli, and Nadia Ahmad. So let me briefly introduce them in the order that they will speak, and then turn the floor over to them to begin to share some thoughts and to give the audience hopefully fodder for question. So Professor Daniel Farber is the Sho Sato Professor of Law and the Faculty Director of the Center for Law, Energy, and Environment at Berkeley Law. He's written very extensively about climate change and disaster issues, among many others, including constitutional law questions, and he's really one of the leading voices in the field. Today, Professor Farber will help frame our conversation by discussing the physical and economic impacts of COVID and COVID recovery measures, and kind of framing out some of the governance challenges and opportunities that have and will could arise in this context. He'll be followed by Dr. Leslie Ann Duvik-Paoli. Dr. Duvik-Paoli is a senior lecturer in environmental law at King's College London and the deputy director of its Climate Law and Governance Center. Her scholarship centers on international environmental law with a particular interest for the ambiguous role played by environmental principles. She's currently on research leave at the Paris Institute for Advanced Study, working in partnership with the Sorbonne University on a new project looking at how law can help protect and reimagine democracy in the context of the climate crisis, such a timely topic. Today, her comments will focus more specifically on the rule of law and in particular the limits and opportunities of drawing upon international environmental law to address COVID and climate-related impacts. Our final speaker is Professor Nadia Ahmad. Professor Ahmad is an associate professor at Barry University School of Law and the coordinator of the Environmental and Earth Law Certificate Program. Her work spans questions of energy siting, the environment, and sustainable development, and draws on international investment law and corporate social responsibility. She's also one of the co-authors of the textbook Environmental Justice, Law, Policy, and Regulation. Today, she'll help us think about how we move forward amidst the complex social, economic, and justice-based challenges that arise at the COVID-climate intersection. Now, let's get started. And just a reminder to the audience, share your questions and thoughts in the Q&A box, and I'll try to keep track of those. Professor Farber, over to you.
Thanks, Cinnamon. I want to touch on three subjects: the impact of COVID on carbon emissions, the possibility of a green recovery for the economy, and some of the lessons for governance. So let me start with the impact on emissions. When the economy crashed in April, there was a huge impact on use and production of fossil fuels. With people staying home, the oil market crashed. In fact, for one brief moment of time, some prices went negative, meaning that oil producers were actually willing to pay to have oil taken off their hands. Oil prices have gone back up now to about 2/3 of their pre-COVID levels. US coal use also dropped more sharply than natural gas, continuing the industry's rapid decline in the past decade. In the meantime, renewable energy continued to expand. You can put solar panels on a roof or put up wind turbines and still maintain social distancing. The overall drop in emissions globally for the year ended up being about 7%. It would have been larger except for the very rapid economic rebound in China, due to the fact that the Chinese took drastic measures to bring the disease under control. In the rest of the world, including the US, there's been some recovery since April, but economies remain in distress. And we continue to have a high level of unemployment here in the US. Those economic issues raise the question of green recovery. How will governments manage the spending that economists say is necessary to get the economy back on its feet and deal with the millions and millions of people who are now in need? There have been repeated calls, including from international organizations, for a green recovery. The International Energy Agency has called for $1 trillion in spending by 2023 in order to cut emissions. The deputy director of the IMF has also called for a green recovery. And the EU has been out in front on this issue, as it often seems to be on climate issues. The EU recovery plan, finalized at the end of last year, includes $720 billion for climate resilience, meaning both efforts to reduce emissions and also efforts to prepare communities for the impacts of climate change. Germany within the EU is spending a third of its recovery funds on renewables, electric vehicles, and public transport. So there's a lot going on there. There are also less perhaps dramatic measures in a number of other countries. What will happen in the US remains unclear, although the odds of a green recovery are certainly a lot better than they were before the election. It's not clear at this point whether Biden's $1.9 trillion relief package will include any dedicated funding for climate or energy. There's also talk of a possible infrastructure bill down the road. Presumably that would include some major spending for a green recovery, but at this point, it's very hard to assess what the bill might look like or what its prospects would be. There's some evidence from the 2008 financial crisis and the stimulus program at that time that this kind of spending can make a long-term difference in the trajectory of emissions. The large investment made by the Obama administration in renewable energy really shifted the trajectory from its previous pathway. So this could be very important in the long run for efforts to reduce emissions. Let me turn to some lessons for governance. I do more work on transnational governance than on international public law. And in the climate regime, action by individual nations, by state and local governments has been very important. As with climate change, nation states have played the primary role in COVID response with important support from international institutions like the World Health Organization. But cities and states have also shown great initiative, which we've seen in the US, where much of the COVID response has actually been handled by state governments. And also in the case of climate change, state and local governments in the US have been very active. That's not just the case in the US. We see a similar pattern in Brazil under Bolsonaro, in which both on COVID and on climate, local governments like São Paulo have acted on their own at a time when the national government has been very passive. So we see some similar efforts at transnational, some national responses, but COVID also illustrates the limits of those responses when you're dealing with a problem that is global in scope. It's really just not possible for individual states or cities to adequately deal with the COVID crisis. And it's also quite clear that strong action at higher levels of government will also be necessary in dealing with climate change. Now, a second lesson I see is how seemingly disparate areas of global concern are converging, like public health and climate change. The WHO, which has played an important role in the COVID response, actually is very active on issues of urban air pollution, which are largely caused by fossil fuels, and on climate change. It views both of those as serious public health issues. On the disaster side, the international frameworks for disaster response are starting to take climate change seriously, while the climate negotiations have begun to devote more attention to climate-related disasters. I think public health has not gotten as much attention from climate negotiators, but it definitely needs to. So we see that these global problems really connect in a lot of ways. It's certainly not true that all problems are the same problem. But what does seem to be true is that global problems are more interlinked than our siloed international and national institutions for dealing with them. And that's a governance structure we're going to have to be dealing with. So at this point, I'm pleased to turn this over to the next speaker. I'm really looking forward to hearing what my fellow panelists have to say. Thank you.
Dr. David Paoli, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cinnamon, for the invitation, and also a big thank you to the American Society for organizing this panel. So what I'd like to do in this talk is to look at the pandemic through the lens of international environmental law. So not only climate stricto sensu, but also challenges in relation to biodiversity, land use changes, for instance, that are so intrinsically linked to this climate problem. So first of all, I'd like to think a little bit about the intersections between the pandemic and environmental challenges, looking at what this pandemic has revealed about the state of international environmental law and its shortcomings. And then I will be looking very briefly at how this pandemic has disrupted our foundations of environmental law and our understanding of environmental law. I was hoping, after discussing intersections and disruptions, to come up with solutions just because it rhymed, but that's probably more for our discussion afterwards. So in terms of intersections between the pandemic and our global responses to environmental degradation, I think the first type of intersection that we're seeing is a causality relationship between the pandemic and the shortcomings of international environmental law. COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease, meaning that it has its origins in a pathogen found in an animal that has then been passed on to humans. And these diseases are not new and actually form the majority of emerging diseases. However, the risk of such a transmission happening have become higher as industrialization, urbanization, and deforestation have really led to the disappearance of a traditional buffer zones that used to separate humans from animals and their pathogen. So really, the health of our environment and of humans is just so intertwined that the Lancet in July 2020 editorial argued that pandemics caused by zoonosis have become a characteristic of the Anthropocene, our current geological age, in which human activity has become, is seen as a dominant influence on climate and the environment. So in other words, the weaknesses of international environmental law in terms of its inability to prevent global environmental changes are leading to an increase in pandemics caused by zoonosis. And we have seen probably some direct links between the degradation of our environment and the emergence of a new coronavirus, with researchers at Cambridge, for instance, recently publishing a piece on how climate change might have exacerbated the risk of a pandemic, arguing that understanding the global distribution of bat species and how this might have shifted as a result of climate change may be an important step in trying to reconstruct the origins of the coronavirus outbreak. We've talked about the now famous pangolin, the world's most trafficked mammal, that really, irrespective of the facts of whether it has actually played a role in this pandemic, really has highlighted the weaknesses of a convention on international trade in endangered species, despite the fact that it is recognized as a very successful international treaty in the environment field. So all this is a bit of a cause for concern when we look at the pandemics report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services that was published this summer, and that said that there's around 1.7 million currently undiscovered viruses that are thought to exist, and around half of them would have the ability to infect humans, really strengthening the argument that international environmental law needs to be strengthened in order to avoid the next pandemic. The second intersection that I see relates to how we look at our responses to the pandemic and to climate change. And so looking at using a comparative lens to look at the situation in which we are, we of course see that both problems are existential threats, are collective action problems, really raise questions about science and experts and how we use this scientific knowledge. But I think it really questions how and whether we are able to anticipate risks. We've seen that the pandemic has really been a failure of anticipation at very different levels, starting from at the very beginning, from China's notification of a new disease to the World Health Organization that seems to have coming a bit late, and then Western countries being unable to take this threat seriously, or at least assess the threat properly, thinking that it was only a flu. So this situation leads us to question really, will climate change, will it be our next big collective failure to anticipate a risk that is foreseeable? So the pandemic has really reinforced a number of messages and warnings that were being sent from the environmental community about the risks of and the costs of delaying environmental action. So it's really quite asking questions about to which extent do we mitigate or adapt, both in terms of climate change and the pandemic? Do we really see the climate problem as a technological problem, a bit like governments are putting their hopes in the test, trace, and isolate system that is so often failing? Or do we accept that it is actually much more than a technological fix, and that we need to see it also as a social problem, one in which we need to question the impact that these new measures are having on democratic societies, and question and think about how to involve citizens to ensure acceptability and support. The third type of intersection relates more to the solutions that we can give both to the pandemic and climate change, and to the complementarity of those solutions. We've been talking about economic recovery and the convergence there, but also in terms of the rights-based approach to international environmental law that has been developing in recent years, and that can also provide solutions to the inequalities that have been emerging, or at least that have been put under the spotlight by the coronavirus pandemic. And I won't talk too much about it because I think we'll discuss this much more, but the right to water, the right to access to energy, the right to access to food, the right to a clean air, all have had significant impacts on how the pandemic has affected certain populations. So now moving on to how the pandemic has disrupted international environmental law, we've seen that domestically, at least, environmental law has been weakened as a result, with an opportunity for certain populist governments to roll back environmental legislation, or a situation of emergency being understood as an excuse to weaken environmental protection, or simply a disorganization of the administration as the pandemic was starting. So this has been a cause for concern at the international level. The Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, for instance, ringing the alarm bell and saying that COVID-19 must not be used as an excuse to weaken environmental protection, or the Aarhus Compliance Committee expressing concerns that parties may attempt to justify restrictions on the rights guaranteed by the Convention by reference to the pandemic or the need for rapid economic recovery. But I think this pandemic is also raising questions about whether environmental law as it stands today is still fit for purpose. The pandemic has questioned certain techniques that we use in environmental law, such as targets, for instance, that seem to have completely lost their meaning now that we are not in the same type of economic growth as we were last year. And it's also raising questions about the world after coronavirus and the values that we would like to see in environmental law. If we consider that environmental law is reflective of societal values, then how have our values changed during this pandemic? And do we need, as a result, to change environmental law? And how will environmental law actually respond to certain new risks that have emerged as a result of a pandemic, and in particular, our use of plastics that is becoming increasingly problematic as a result of a pandemic. So all this to say, we can see, if we look at the interactions between COVID-19 and international environmental law, it is a good way to highlight certain of the shortcomings and inabilities that international environmental law has in its mission to protect both humans but also the environment. As a result, I think it is quite important to think about how we need to change our approach and our understanding of what environmental law really is and what it can achieve. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now over to Professor Ahmad to kind of offer the final thoughts, and just a reminder to the audience that feel free at any point to go ahead and use the Q&A box for questions and answer. And we'll try to get to some of those in a few minutes. But Professor Ahmad, would love to hear your thoughts now.
Thank you so much. I really wanted to thank Cinnamon Carling, Jackie Peel, Maxine Burkett, and Dan Badomsky for really leading the ASIL new signature topic on international climate change law. I also wanted to thank Wes Rist for helping us organize this panel and providing the introduction. I wanted to spend the first part of my talk speaking about the need for the pandemic recovery to incorporate renewable energy relief on a global scale, and then also look at the ways that the climate change initiatives post-pandemic, and as the pandemic is ongoing, also have to consider vulnerable populations. And so for my first point, I wanted to build upon what Dan had mentioned earlier about the economics of what has happened during the coronavirus. So on the day before Earth Day 2020, the unimaginable happened. The price of oil was negative. The analysts called it off the charts wacky. Oil producers were paying buyers to take the commodities off their hands for fear that storage capacity would run out by May 2020. And the coronavirus lockdowns dried up demand for oil as people remained indoors under quarantine and under self-isolations through social distancing mandates. Oil firms were resorting to renting up tankers in order to store excess supply that forced the price of US oil into the negative range. And at one point, the price of West Texas Intermediate, the benchmark for US oil, fell as low as $37 a barrel, minus $37 a barrel. So the correct policy response would have been to level up the transition to renewables instead of enhance price protections for fossil fuels, as the United States federal government did at the time. Meanwhile, in Abu Dhabi, the international governmental organization known as the International Renewable Energy Agency was focusing on aligning the COVID-19 recovery efforts with the ideas behind the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. There's a sharp contrast between the American as well as the global response from IRENA in response to energy shocks, which were going to be telltale of the future of energy transitions and how far behind the curve America was in terms of the pandemic response and energy transitions, and how far it will remain behind. And so the coronavirus also highlighted the difference between different energy regime complexes. IRENA recommended policy proposals to mobilize and increase international cooperation. The coronavirus recovery response, the IRENA coalition recommended, should consider the deadlines for renewable energy projects facing near-term obligations and list the renewable energy industry and related infrastructure as critical infrastructure and extend renewable energy solutions both at the centralized and decentralized levels. And as governments were considering stimulus packages for rapid economic recovery, as we are right now in the United States, one of the things the IRENA coalition recommended was for the prioritization of renewable energy to phase out fossil fuel development. And so The way for that to happen is to look at the availability of public financial support to improve the mobilization of private investments in renewables, as well as enhance the role of renewables in industrial policy and growth, and revisions to labor and educational initiatives to forward a just transition, and allow for a shift for renewable energy jobs, and more so about the strengthening of international cooperation for the acceleration of renewable transition. COVID-19 also strained national budgets as to the short and medium-term energy access investments, which may now start to appear to be a low priority for governments. And so, as you heard from my co-panelists, now is not the time to push back against these types of green growth initiatives. Because the underinvestment could drastically limit the capacity of rural health workers to support frontline health workers, as well as essential services to COVID-19 patients. When the vaccine becomes more readily available, cold storage and refrigerated transport across large areas will be crucial, and decentralized renewable energy technologies such as solar will be key to large-scale immunization efforts in developing countries. And more so, stagnant progress in mainstreaming clean energy cooking solutions will also increase risk factors to exposure to particulates in COVID-19. And in terms of shifting toward the broader context and the pandemic response, movements that have been happening, social movements more broadly, especially the movements in response to the killing of George Floyd, as well as migration, climate change, environmental justice, and mass incarceration, all of these ideas became more linked together as we saw during this lockdown. And so it's no longer possible for us to draw neat borders around the white spaces of first world countries, sprawling suburbs, and countryside settings. Environmentalism and climate change adaptation efforts can no longer be the exclusive domain of protecting white spaces in the bloc of OECD countries. Because of rising income inequality in poor nations, conflict and political upheaval, migrants are seeking out new places for safety. And so from natural disasters to the horrors of famine, disease, and religious violence, people are moving. And we are a planet of populations on the move. The arrest and detention of rapper 21 Savage in Atlanta a few years ago offers a lens into the carceral state as well as environmentalism, which also highlights the constraints of environmental law, international law, and the pressures that climate change advocates face. NYU journalism professor Sukitu Mehta draws from the work of Columbia law professor Michael Gerard, who has put forward that the United States and other nations disproportionately responsible for carbon emissions should accept climate change refugees as a form of compensation to them and as a form of justice. The rash of immigration detentions, deportations, self-deportations really highlight parallel environmental struggles. While the struggles may diverge, the systems at play operate in hegemonic unison. If before immigration was previously the province of political asylum cases and highly educated professionals seeking work visas, climate change has expanded and intensified those struggles. The information technology engineer from Chennai, India, wanting a better life for family in America is not only seeking out economic opportunity, but a way out of India's rising communalism and the failed efforts to stem rising waters of the Indian Ocean, as well as the lack of potable water. 2 summers ago, the water reservoirs of India's 6th largest city, the city of my grandmother's birth, ran dry. Back in the United States, the arrest of 21 Savage in Atlanta, a later blackout in a New York federal prison, arrest of meatpacking workers in Mississippi, the lack of AC and heat in Texas prisons today are considered isolated events, but taken together, they're part of a wider net of mass incarceration to silence environmental, labor, and human rights, as well as examples of denying access to protection from environmental impacts in the US context, with broader global impacts. Climate change will increase extreme weather events, increasing vulnerabilities for those already at the margins, from prison populations to those attempting perilous border crossings. These incidences were a way to preserve an economic system known as corporatism through racist immigration and incarceration policies, which later manifest in disparate responses to environmental pollution in the United States, whether in Flint, Michigan, looking at the Dakota Access Pipeline, and even the current protests that are happening on the fighting of Line 3 in Minnesota. In other words, caging has become a strategy, both legal, financial, and political, being used to silence the critics of the corporatist system, which capitalizes upon and targets marginalized communities and vulnerable populations. Corporatism is a system of interest and/or attitude representation, a particular modal or ideal typical institutional arrangement for linking the associationally organized interests of civil society with the decisional structures of the state. All the while, the impacts of corporatism are also environmental in that those impacts work to silence environmental efforts and demonstrate adverse impacts of climate change on environmental efforts. And so these adverse impacts on climate change particularly impact frontline communities, in that vulnerable communities that are located in sacrifice zones have less of a right to be here in the United States or on the planet, and therefore require less of a need for a clean environment. The ancient adage from Cicero, summum jus, summum injuria, inspired modern conversation about how severe laws may need to be retooled because of the intended as well as unintended consequences of the increases in laws that may lead to more injustice and more inequality. And so more laws, more prisons, more detentions, and more inhumane conditions create more chaos, uncertainty, and insecurity in communities. The American logic of the carceral state mirrors other countries which have also implemented punitive and lengthy prison sentences which adversely impact marginalized communities. This process of increased carcerality could be occurring independently across the globe. Yet investigative reporting suggests that the US Department of State has been providing rule of law initiatives to expand carcerality in foreign countries. So not only has America expanded its own prisons, the American idea of the carceral state has also expanded through rule of law programs for prison systems. Changes in the carceral state that may actually reduce crime and carcerality itself tend to be ignored in favor of programs that increase construction of prisons and create jobs for prison workers. The reach of mass incarceration will create climate cages versus workable solutions to climate change. In light of the dire predictions of climate change leading to the possible extinction of tens of millions of human beings by mid-century, a solution for survival, not just for construction and fortification of buildings, should be the lessening of laws that criminalize immigration and imprison frontline communities in disproportionate rates is absolutely essential. And so I would argue in the end that the urgent action be used to halt extinction include total and absolute divestment from fossil fuel development, as well as the abolition of prisons and immigrations and customs enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you so much to each of you. There's so much interesting kind of fodder for conversation there. We have one open question, but perhaps I'll start us off with, one of the themes that really kind of ran throughout each of your comments was this idea of fragmentation and silos as, kind of governance structures being barriers in the past. In the context of domestic law, we think about this, at the intersection of Dan and Nadia's comments of the way in which our social movements of the past really grew up in isolation from one another, but how they're really intersecting now and forcing us to think at the intersection of environment inequality, racial inequality, income inequality. And in the international environmental space, our structures grew up in terms of institutional isolation, biodiversity, air, water. And we're now in a world where we're actually really being forced to think about them. And so kind of the question is, is climate law environmental law, or is it something more? Or is it a vehicle for really beginning to think about issues in a much more comprehensive way? And is COVID helping us? And what are the kind of the costs and benefits of that? And so I don't know if each of you want to speak to that, but I really see that as the kind of the point at which many of your comments were beginning to intersect. So just I'll open that up for any comments, and then we'll turn to the questions that are popping in from the audience.
Well, I can start. It's a difficult question, but I think it's a very, very important one. And I think I'll just say just a few words, because when I was thinking about my presentation, I was really thinking about, do I talk only about climate change, and is that actually possible, when I think the problem is just global environmental changes, including climate change, but not only. And I think something that is quite interesting to see now is that climate change, it of course has created its kind of own legal sphere with climate lawyers that are hyper specialized, which I think can also be a problem. But on the other hand, if we look at biodiversity, for instance, we don't really see people saying that they are biodiversity lawyers. There are actually scholars working on biodiversity, but they probably talk about themselves in terms of being environmental lawyers. But I think in terms of biodiversity, we are seeing but it's becoming increasingly important question, probably on par with climate change. And I think that here there are really opportunities to make the link between climate change and biodiversity. And so the question now is, if we are all climate change lawyers, do we also need to all be biodiversity lawyers as well?
Dan, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting question. I do think climate change at least can help focus attention on the ways in which global problems are interlinked and can't be addressed in isolation. And I think the reason for that is just that climate change has such pervasive effects on many aspects of society, but also reducing emissions actually means some very broad transformations in not only our energy system, but in how we do urban planning, how we think about agriculture, many other parts of society. For that reason, I think, it's a reminder of just how closely, all these systems are, how closely related they are. I don't think it's plausible to think we're going to combine everything in one big organization or agency that does everything, but we really do need to find ways of better connecting and networking the institutions that work on these individual problems so that they can, work in tandem and with the awareness of the interactions between them. I think it's also really interesting the ways in which the climate issue is clearly intertangled with issues of inequality, as Nadia was discussing. And we see now in the Biden administration, there's some real efforts to start thinking in a serious way about how a climate policy, among other things, really needs to also be inequality policy or equality policy. And so, I think that I do see some really intriguing possibilities there.
Thanks. And Nadia, I know, a lot of your comments focused on the kind of intersectional nature of climate change and all of the challenges to which it gives rise. But, interestingly, while we're talking about institutions and the silos of institutions and the possibilities of institutions, part of your core arguments is it's the institutions themselves that are the problem. And so I don't know if you want to comment on the way in which, thinking about climate change in this intersectional way, while at the same time we're trying to think about institutional deconstruction, is both filled with possibilities and problems. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think what I would say is that I'm more hopeful now than I've ever been at the possibilities of really having breakthroughs for both climate change adaptation efforts as well as environmental justice. And really the climate movement worldwide has been a youth movement led by youth activists. It's also been led and pushed forward by a lot of different grassroots movements. And so I think there's some key takeaways, especially that we see from both the Sunrise Movement and the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States in President Biden's environmental justice plan. One of those issues, I think, and I just want to highlight a few of them, is the initiative towards healthcare resiliency and infrastructure jobs. And so President Biden has sought to ensure that the jobs that are created for these types of industries are filled by diverse, local, and well-trained workers, including women and people of color. There's also been emphasis, rightfully so, for safe drinking water and having specific tools put in place for environmental justice screening. There's also an emphasis towards creating an equitable disaster risk reduction program, so that if there's a natural or a national crisis that emerges, that there's a way to address climate disasters that prioritize equitable disaster risk reduction and response. And so I think this is part of a global effort as well. But I think that this type of policy discussion is new in the United States, and I think this is welcoming.
Thank you. Now let's turn to a question we have from the audience, and I'll read it. So from Caroline Foster in New Zealand. So thank you for joining us. So the question is, she wants to ask panelists about the thoughts on corporate social responsibility in the context of a green recovery, including whether and how the precautionary principle, and Leslie Ann, I know you think a lot about principles, whether the precautionary principle, especially as a facet of the principle on prevention, may and should have legal and political sway with corporate decision-making. Anybody have thoughts on that? Leslie, and maybe it's also an opportunity to think about principles more broadly. You know, in the context of international environmental law, principles are incredibly important, and there's a lot of conversations about them, but they plays out a little bit less in domestic environmental law. So they're kind of separate conversations. I don't know if you want to jump in.
Yes, sure. Thanks, Caroline, for the question. So I'm not really an expert in corporate social responsibility. But I think the question is really, what would be the role of precaution or prevention here, and would it help? So would we use that principle in order to actually force corporations to or to encourage corporations to feel bound by this principle? And in a sense, I'm a bit worried because, for instance, corporations often use sustainable development goals as a justification for their policies, but it's often used as a buzzword and not really to think in depth about how their policies might or might not align with the sustainable development agenda. So I would be a little bit worried if we were to use just the precautionary principle in that way, and that's something that we often hear, and even in the context of a pandemic and in its health context, we often hear, yeah, well, this is a precautionary approach, but it doesn't mean much if we don't actually really explain what the consequences of applying this principle really means. Or so is that just going to be a kind of buzzword that companies are just going to use in order to justify their actions, or are we going to use those principles to actually force corporations to change, and so in a kind of less political way, but in a more kind of legal and dense norm that we can actually use to force change? And that's where it becomes a bit tricky, because those principles are ambiguous, and as long as you don't actually really define what they mean, I think then they're very much open to interpretation. And so I think it's difficult just to use them legally speaking to force a change. They are, I think, useful to highlight what the priorities should be, but I'm not sure that they can really be the solution for corporate social responsibility in the next few years.
I guess I could follow up on that. I think it's certainly true that greenwashing, the sort of PR use of sustainability or clean energy or other issues, clearly that's widespread. But we also do see some real action by some major corporations in this area. I don't want to write off the good intentions of the corporate leadership as a factor, but I think that a more significant set of factors really come from outside of corporate management, from employees who are mobilized on the climate issue, from customers, from investors who are being realistic about the risks of climate change and about the way that climate policy will change the economy. And not least from an awareness that government interventions are coming down the road. So I think that those provide more substance than I think we would get just from either the desire to look into the public or the desire to of well-intentioned managers of corporations to try to do some good. I think the question about whether something like the precautionary policy should play a role, I think is really an interesting one. It does seem to me that it would be useful to try to impose on corporations a responsibility not to ignore risks merely because of uncertainty, which they have, like other institutions have a tendency to do, but require them to take reasonable precautionary steps in advance, rather than waiting until something turns out to cause huge problems down the road and then only begin to address the issue. So yeah, I thought that was an interesting idea. In the climate area, I do think corporate activity has been a significant part of the transnational governance picture. I think it would be foolish to place too much hope on initiatives by corporations, but I do think that there are some encouraging developments.
And I would add to that, if you look at the case involving Line 3 in Minnesota, there's these parallel movements that are happening at the same time. You have the movement for divestment for fossil fuels that's happening more broadly, and it's just a broad-based coalition of different organizations. Then you also have the direct action that's happening on the ground there, with actions against, led by indigenous leaders. And I think it's important also to think about international human rights in this context, especially considering the United States is a leader in the corporate sector, as well as the many CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are headquartered in the United States or operate at some level in the United States, and seeing that there is also public backlash from negative environmental events that do occur. There's also, I'm starting to see SEC regulation for companies that are not asserting their are not disclosing the climate risk that the companies face in their financial disclosures. There's been lawsuits brought by attorney generals of various states to enforce this issue on large oil and gas companies. Another area where I see some hope for development is in this idea of a mix between self-regulation and mandatory regulation. And so corporate governance at its core encapsulates a really established set of internal processes, customs, policies, and law that are all meshed together. But what it also does, it shapes the role that stakeholders play with these corporate responsibility goals. And so I think that where the hope for it lies is the movement that comes forward from the ground, from the customers, as Dan mentioned, as well as those who are the employees of the company. I mean, we've seen quite a bit of movement from companies on different social issues, such as Starbucks, Walmart, and Amazon. And so I think that type of social movement will continue, but I think it's also there's going to be a lot of labor movements against that as well. So I think it'll really create the perfect mix for possible change or the perfect way to see something stopped.
Great, thank you so much. I see we have more questions rolling in, but I know that we're actually out of time. I just want to kind of say one of the things that I heard from each of you is this kind of a sense of clarity that COVID has brought to actually think about things as they intersect, to be more direct about embracing complexity, to think much more carefully about the way in which we engage with science and uncertainty, and to do so kind of in transparent ways. And I really just want to take a moment to thank each of you for both your work in this space and for joining us in this conversation. To everybody from the audience for being here, for sharing your questions as well. So thank you so much to Nadia Ma, to Leslie-Ann Dubik-Paoli, and to Dan Farber for your thoughts and insights. And I would just hope that we can continue these conversations and that everybody here can join us as we start to think more and more about international climate change law, the challenges and opportunities it poses moving forward. Thank you so much to everyone for being here. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.